Good day, everyone. My name is Joel Galvante, and I'm here to discuss the radio programming formats and structures, or the elements of Radiocraft, on Module 8, Part 6. Let's start this presentation. First, let's look at the objectives. We want to discuss the different structures of Radiocraft and its elements, recognize the different programming formats supported by each of the elements of Radiocraft, and provide samples of radio program formats that are common in the radio industry here in the Philippines. Now let's look at the structures and elements of radio. Before I start, I would like to share first a quote from Lawrence Gilliam, a former head of features in BBC Radio. She said that radio is the art of communicating meaning at first hearing. Now in the following elements, we will be discussing spoken word, sound, and music. To provide you a sample on the structure and elements of radio for spoken word is basically the primary code of radio. It represents the ideas that the listeners must be visualized and imagine. Words that are spoken are oftentimes different from the words read because accents and stresses affect the message. For instance, if someone tells you that they like their dress and they use a grateful or a joyous voice to tell you about it, you would probably receive it as something good. But if the tone or the stresses or accents they've used are sarcastic, you might not feel as receptive. Also, in the structures and elements of radio for spoken word, it should feel as spontaneous and as natural as possible. Because as much as possible, for a lot of listeners, they want to feel like when they are listening to a spoken word, it has to feel very conversational. Now, the following samples, as seen here, are what is most often used for spoken word. There's news, there's radio talk, and there's listener mail. Let's listen to some examples. First, for news.
Inaasahang darating na sa bansa sa susunod na linggo ang 10,000 dose ng bakuna kontra naman sa African Swine Fever. Ayon po sa Department of Agriculture, prioridad na mabigyan ng bakuna yung mga lugar na naka-red zone o yung merong mataas na kaso ng ASF. Bukod pa ito sa paparating na 60,000 dose ng bakuna.
So if you've heard that sample, basically for news, it's very formal, and the tone is very urgent because of the news that it's presenting. So for news, when you're listening to it, it has to make you think that there is something that must be done. Therefore, there is some certain seriousness in a discussion. Now, that is quite different for a radio talk show format. Let's listen to this example.
Hello, sorry for calling you. Busy ka?
Okay lang. Nasa taping lang.
Pero nakasalang ka? Hindi naman.
Mabilis lang.
Hindi naman. Mabilis lang naman. Nag-away kasi kami, tapos parang sobrang mawawala, tapos babalik, mawawala, tapos babalik.
So, if you listen to both samples, there's really quite a stark difference. Because for news, it is strict and it's very formal. But for radio talk show, it's very different. It's quite informal. It's quite they use a lot of colloquial words. Because for radio talk shows, they need to be as entertaining as much as possible. Because that is the purpose of the program. So for radio, it's more on entertainment. And then for news, it's more on talking about serious information. Now let's listen to the listener mail and what makes it different.
Ako nga pala si Judith. I'm a single mom. My baby girl turned 7 last July 26. Nabuntis ako nung ako ay second year college. Halos isumpa ako ng parents ko. Adopted lang kasi ako. Namatay ang mother ko nung ako ay grade 6. Isa siya sa biktima ng lumubog na barko.
Now, if you listen to this one sample for listener mail, it's also very different from using radio talk show. Because for listener mail, they tend to adapt a softer voice, and also because the stories are quite personal, they try to make it feel like they're also very conversational, but almost like a storytelling format, because they want to make the listeners feel that the stories that they are listening to are actually based off on real life. So they are going for authenticity for the listener mail. So as you can see here, for spoken word samples, it needs to be direct to the point, it needs to be engaging, and it needs to evoke some level of spontaneity, because the listeners want to feel like each format is serving its purpose and serving what um what's their purpose for listening to these types of shows. Now let's go for the sound, this element of radio. Now for sound, it signifies a situation or an event, a change or transition in the program. It also helps establish time, mood, and setting. It also suggests an occasion. So, for instance, if you listen to a wedding hymn or a birthday tune being shown or being played in the radio, you'll probably think that that's what's happening on the show. There's a wedding and there's a birthday. It also helps enhance mood or atmosphere. So if you want to use a tense music, you are probably trying to give that kind of atmosphere about what you're also playing on the radio. And sound also helps complete words and adds great effect to your meaning. So what are the sample formats for sound? There's transition, there's laugh tracks, and there's emergency samples for the different formats in sound. So let's listen to an example of the transition sample. So as you can see here, the transition sample really does its job to communicate that there is a transition happening in the program. It's very fast. It gives a thrilling feeling that something is changing. And another sample here, the laugh track. So for the laugh track, this is actually quite a staple in the Filipino radio shows, because laugh tracks provide listeners a cue when the punchline is happening. So it kind of guides the listener on when to laugh, whether it's a drama or it's a show. It kind of helps break tension. And then there's emergency. So emergency is very different between the two, like laugh tracks and transition. Because for emergency, there's this feeling of urgency. And so when people hear this, they're oftentimes reminded that there might be something happening very serious. And it tells the audience that they need their full attention, because what is about to be communicated is something very important. So if you can see here, the following sample formats for sound needs to evoke a response, inform change in the program, and initiates anticipation. Because these elements ultimately inform us on how the program will flow without being too direct, like in spoken word. Now, our last structure or elements for radio is music. Music provides aesthetic output in its own. It helps signify something outside itself, meaning it doesn't need logic or reason for it to make us feel something. That's the great thing about music. It allows us to feel something based on how we are hearing these things. It's also a mainstay in radio programming and evokes a historical or emotional significance. In particular, for a lot of radio shows, some of them have themes, like for instance, Top 40 Radio or 80s Radio. Those are some examples of how a certain era defines um, the emotional state of the listener. Because some people do prefer listening to 80s radio or a some prefer a much more modern radio. And then music also helps identify the radio station through station IDs and jingles. So I'm gonna show you some samples here for music jingle.
Listening to timeless songs on the radio.
So you can see here, um, basically Easy Rock's music jingle is very iconic. It also defines the kind of listeners they have, which is mostly on the millennial side of listenership. So that's what a music jingle must do. It needs to help brand the station so that it can attract the type of audience that it wants. And then there's also top 40 hits.
Blues traveler, and I'm being insincere. In fact, I don't mean any of this. That's not what I'm supposed to. That's what they say in the song.
Right.
Ooh, that was a close one. Up 3 to number 16, Hook.
So that's sample of a top 40 hit music sample format. So basically what a top 40 does is that it does what it says. It lists the top 40 songs either of that era, or if we're using the modern era, it's going to list the number of listenerships per song and how many people listen to these songs. And usually the number one most listened song gets the top position in the top 40 hit. So basically that's it for the different elements of radio. So in conclusion, each element plays a crucial role in the structure of radiocraft. Keeping these elements intact ensures a seamless experience for the listener. A synthesis of having an engaging and spontaneous voice, a clear and identifiable sound, and choosing the right music that evokes emotion are key aspects that make a good radio show or program. And last but not least, each element should complement the others depending on the program's purpose. So basically, that's it. Thank you, everyone, for listening to my short discussion and orientation on the elements of radio craft. So here are my following discussion questions. I will also put it on my discussion thread in Module 8. Thank you, everyone. God bless.